Right now, I'm going to ask Barb to come ahead, and we want to give her as much time today for her communication to us. And I really appreciate her putting the time in. You'll see she's made some wonderful slides. It's going to be a good class. So sit back and hold on, and Dr. Barb's going to start. And I want to remind you, if you have any questions through chat, you can send them to me, and then I will communicate those to Barb here, and we can answer any questions you might have right here this morning. So tell you what, I'm going to sign off for a bit, and Barb's going to start.
So good morning, ladies. I really treasure the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the biologic differences between men and women. And as Elisa had said, we've been going through this book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. And if you've read chapter 16, it's actually the biologic basis for gender-specific behavior. However, I have taken the liberty to switch streams because I like the biologic aspect, and I would like to talk about a different book. And this book is actually by Walt and Barbara Larimore. They live down in Colorado Springs. He's a family practice physician there, a phenomenal Christian, and it talks about how divinely designed differences can strengthen your marriage. But I believe it also holds true for single people as well, as we discover what God has done for each of us to match the roles that he has designated for us. Now, I do have a disclaimer, or a disclosure, I should say, and that is that some of these texts are somewhat graphic. It's not pictures, but I would say if there are people that have children in their homes, they may not want them to hear some of this. And so I would say, please use your discretion. I have not reviewed these slides with Elisa, so she is not to blame. So I will take all the blame for anything that occurs here. But, you know, from a surgeon's standpoint, I mean, it's all free game. So anyhow, let's go ahead with the slides. And if you can, I would make the bigger screen the slide screen, because I am primarily just going to be lecturing from these slides. So let's go to the next slide here. This is the book that actually I have been using. It's called His Brain, Her Brain by the Larimers, and they have very interesting comments to make. And in the book, it does state that differences are not just a matter of our imagination. And you can understand that, anybody that's been married. There are numerous books, even in the Christian literature, that show the differences between men and women. I just love the title of this last book here. It states that men are like waffles and women are like spaghetti. But I've also heard that men are like from Mars and women are from Venus. So there are definite differences, and we do see it differently. So there's a story that's been told by an English professor who wrote on the blackboard these words, and I hope you can see it. The professor then directed the students to punctuate the phrase, and most of the men wrote, "A woman without her man is nothing." However, most of the women recorded, "A woman without her man is nothing." So obviously we see very differently. And King David observed that God knew how we were formed even in the womb, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. and that we are woven together and nothing is hidden from him. In Psalm 139. So our differences, unbelievably so, have been wired in the womb. There is no unisex brain. Girls arrive already wired as girls, and boys arrive already wired as boys. Their brains are different by the time they are born, despite what researchers assert, that the differences that we see are a result of nurture over nature. So when we take a look at the development of the brain, it's a result of three major things that I want to go into, and that is God's biologic design, genetics, and hormones. These influence each other to create man and woman. The divine design, God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Men and women were created equally, therefore, in the image of God. But the Bible also makes it clear that equal is not synonymous to the same. There are different roles. So I want to take you through some of the anatomy, and I've named this Anatomy for Dummies because it is, Elisa says it fits, but you know, in all honesty, I am not a neurosurgeon, and it was one of the worst subjects that I had. I really had trouble with neurology. So, however, I'm going to go over what we know and take a look at God's design. And there are several areas that we're going to look at, and I'm primarily focusing in on the nervous system and how it's affected, because that relates to our entire body. We'll talk about the brain, the limbic system, and the cortical lobes. So the brain itself, as you can see here in the diagram, there's the cortex, the spinal cord, and the cerebellum. You know what's fascinating about the brain is that it's about 3 pounds. It uses up 20% of the oxygen that we breathe and about 25% of the calories that we eat. Now, if we look at the brain, 100 billion neurons are present in our brain. And if you can imagine the Milky Way, our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy has 100 billion planets and stars. That's how many neurons we have in our brain. The brain has 100 trillion connections or synapses that operate at lightning speed. And it handles about 10 quadrillion instructions per second, which is 10 times faster than the fastest supercomputer that we have here on Earth. 10 quadrillion. And don't ask me how many zeros that is. But you can understand that our brain is synthesizing all of these things: our position, our blood pressure, our heart rate, our breathing, all of the sensations that we feel. All of these impulses are coming in at the same time, every single second. The male brain is about 10 times larger, so you'd expect him to be more intelligent. But in all honesty, men and women, however, consistently score equally on intelligence tests. Male brains contain 6.5 times more gray matter, the thinking matter, but female brains contain 9.5 times more white matter, and that is the processing matter. So as a result of that, as women, we have better communication between different modes of perceiving and relating to the world, whereas men show a stronger concentration on working on any one of those particular modes. Now let's take a quick look at the limbic system. It is wrapped around the brainstem. It is designed to assist us in responding to sensory responses from the outside world. And what are those sensory responses? Of course, they're stimuli that are coming in from our eyes, our nose, ears, our taste buds. They all are processed in this limbic system. And when a stimulus is associated with an emotion for the first time, this creates an emotional memory that's imprinted in the limbic system. So for example, if I go over to the Sens and Elisa prepares a wonderful meal,
Which would be rare these days.
then I can remember that emotional memory and embed it in my brain, in my limbic system, so that when it comes back again, it actually passes through that limbic system up to the upper portion of my brain. And it's part of our memory system. Now here's the limbic system. So it gets a little bit detailed, but don't worry, I'm not going to get too technical here. And so the major parts of this, as you can see, the amygdala and the hippocampus are far larger and active in the women, and they better connect with the verbal and the emotional aspect of our brain. Men are less likely to remember their emotional experiences, and their limbic system is better connected to their spinal cord instead of their cortex. So what does that mean? Well, if they're connected better, then men are less likely to be as good expressing their feelings verbally, but more likely to respond physically. And what did God create man for? Man was there to protect, to provide. So that physical aspect of protection, etc., is already built in his brain. Likewise, the cingulate gyrus is much larger and active in women. So when we look at the various parts of the brain, we'll take a look at this hypothalamus, which Walt Larimer actually labels as the sex center. This is highly sensitive to testosterone and is much larger in men. Now, our hypothalamus, in all honesty, does multiple things because it releases a lot of releasing factors, but I won't go into the biology of that. The amygdala amplifies memory, pleasant and fearful memories, and communicates with the hippocampus, which processes and stores those emotional memories. These things are larger, actually, in women. And the cingulate gyrus is considered the key emotional center. It helps to connect to the cortex, to the hemispheres that we'll talk about here. So the cortical lobes, I won't go into that too much, but if we look at the brain, there are 4 lobes on each side: the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. And if you can look over to the left side of your screen, you can see that each lobe has a specific action. The parietal notes temperature and touch and pressure, whereas the frontal is more involved in speech, motion, emotions, problem solving, etc. And each of those lobes are made up of gray matter as well as white matter. Oh, now that popped up. Okay. The gray matter is the processing thinking matter. whereas the white matter are these long fibers, these axons, that transmit the signal around the brain as well as to and from the body. When we look at male and female brains, you can see there, the male brain has much more white matter, connecting the thinking and reacting centers to the spinal cord, whereas the white matter of female brains is more connected to the hemispheres, to the cortex, to the top of the brain. Therefore, men are designed more for physical reactions over thinking, and women are designed for multitasking. Now, when we take a look at these hemispheres that we talked about, okay, so there's 4 lobes on the right and 4 lobes on the left. These 2 lobes, these 2 hemispheres of our brain do different things. And there's a lot of information here, but the things that we might want to think about is that if a person has a stroke on the left side, it controls the right side of the body. If a person has a stroke on the right side of the brain, it controls the left side of the body. The rational side of the brain is on the left. The creative and artistic side is on the right. And when we go down these columns, the hemispheres do various things. What's interesting is that these hemispheres are connected like by a cable, and it's called the corpus callosum. And this is much greater in women. It's much larger, and that helps her to have greater subconscious processing power, actually, than the men. So when we look at this, his brain, her brain, like I said, the corpus callosum connects the 2 sides, the right side of the brain to the left. It's much larger in women. And all of the emotional system that you can see, which is mostly the limbic system and the language centers of women, actually tend to be highly connected, as you can see just going down each column there. The men's brain are less connected, but more connected to the spinal cord, whereas the women's are more connected to the cortex. This does not mean that there is a problem with respect to what God has made us to do, because in the male brain, we need to have a protector that can act quickly, whereas in women, we need to be able to multitask, to take care of the children, to be able to nurture, to have the relationships. So let's take a look at something other than the biologic design. We're going to look now at some of the genetics and how that affects that brain. Okay, with the genetics, obviously sex chromosomes contribute directly to the development of the sex difference in the brain. Now, most of you, if you go back to genetics, realize that the man has an X and a Y, and many of the genes on the Y chromosome are involved in male differentiation and development. So, for example, it directs the gonadal tissue of a boy to become a testes, so that there's more testosterone produced. And believe it or not, this is occurring even in the womb. That brain is being washed with testosterone. In a woman, there's 2 X's, and 1 X chromosome is more active, and the brain varies depending on which X chromosome is actually active. But the other X chromosome has a few genes that have not been inactivated, that are actually activated. And because of this excess genes, it results in more genetic diversity, making women not only different from men, but also women are very different from each other. And that is a consequence of these inactivated genes. So when the men say they can't figure out a woman. Well, it's no wonder they can't figure out a woman, because we are so different one from the other. How about hormones? How does that affect the brain? We're going to get a little bit more into the specific hormones, and as I said, I would ask you to have discretion with your children. But there are 70 different chemicals that are majorly impacting our brain. We are just going to go quickly over 6 of them. Testosterone, as I said, is associated with the male. It's associated with male aggressiveness, competitiveness, assertiveness, that assertiveness that a man needs to be able to lead, to have the authority. Even at 6 weeks of gestation, that unborn boy is having his brain washed with testosterone. And for those women that have been pregnant with baby boys, in comparison to having a baby girl, those boys are twitching and punching and pushing in the womb even before they are born. The testosterone also causes that beltway that we talked about between the right brain and the left brain, the corpus callosum, that pipeline that has 3 million fibers. It causes that to shrink down in size in comparison to women. Testosterone helps a man to focus on a project, a competition, a mission, a venture. I've often thought that this was one of my problems with praying, because so often my brain is multitasking and I cannot seem to focus a lot of times as I would like to. Testosterone stimulates the desire to succeed, for achievement, to provide, and to protect. And these are the very things that God has deemed as man's role. It drives men for independence and therefore sometimes for being alone. But it also makes one want to have sex, and it does increase in women at the time of ovulation. This is sort of a miraculous thing that God would have so that it would help in procreation. Each of us has a certain amount of testosterone and estrogen, but it is in different amounts. When we take a look at oxytocin, it is released. I don't think it went through.
It came on mine.
Oh, did it? Okay.
We've got it.
It is released when couples hug and they cuddle. There's a slight delay on the slide, so I'm sorry about that. It increases sensitivity to touch and feeling of bonding, especially in women. And what do women need? We need to have the ability to bond to those that we're nurturing, such as our children. It spurs on the tend and befriend behaviors, as opposed to testosterone that's more fight and flight response. It helps women to be sexually receptive and also increases the satisfaction of lovemaking in women, even without an orgasm. It increases nurturing feelings towards her children and triggers the letdown reflex of breastfeeding. These are all wonderful things that God has created to allow women to do the role that they are called to do. The one time that a man's level of oxytocin is actually equal to women's is either during or immediately after an orgasm. And it increases longer when the man is with his wife. This is a wonderful thing, because as the oxytocin increases and the man is stimulated by his wife, it increases his bonding to his wife. It increases what God has actually wanted us to have, which is a monogamy. to be bonded to be one flesh with your wife and your husband. Vasopressin originates in the hypothalamus and regulates sexual persistence, aggression, hierarchical displays, and territorial markings. And so, as you can imagine, the Y chromosome increases the vasopressin, producing fibers in males. It increases during sexual foreplay in men, but not in women. Serotonin tends to calm us down. As you can imagine, men have far less serotonin than women. Thus, the lower serotonin and oxytocin cause men to act more impulsively and react physically, choosing action first and talk second. Whereas the higher serotonin and oxytocin in women lead women to become more willing and capable than men to sit calmly, to engage in conversation, and to do childcare. Once again, God's design for women to be leading her children, her family, and meeting their needs. As we look at estrogen, it has a calming effect and aids memory. I can tell you that one, especially after losing it. And is higher during the first half of the menstrual cycle, making one more alert and sensitive to stimuli. Also gives one a higher self-esteem, enthusiasm, pleasure, and sexual arousal. And progesterone, lastly, causes one to be more parental and nurturing. It too has a calming effect, aids memory, and is a relaxant, so that when the levels plummet in women just before their period or after giving birth, women feel more restless and have difficulty in sleeping. And so often women will complain about they can't sleep after giving birth, etc. Much of this is related to our hormones that, unlike men, are fluctuating like crazy, day in and day out. However, at real high levels, it causes the brain to be sluggish and results in decreased libido and increased depression. And during the second half of the menstrual cycle, this is somewhat what some women will experience. So I know I've thrown a lot of information at you about these hormones, but this is like a little summary. Here, look at the top chemicals, the oxytocin, serotonin, estrogen, progesterone. They are higher in a woman, helping her to be able to have the impulse to nurture, to be there for her children. Men have higher testosterone and vasopressin. They are the ones that should be the providers, the protectors. This is very high in men and very low in women. And that just helps us to understand that because women have these fluctuating hormones, they have very different moods, needs, feelings, symptoms at all sorts of different times. And it's not just because we want to be difficult about things and men look at us like we're fluctuating here and there, but a lot of it has to do with our hormones that are fluctuating with each and every month. I thought we would just sort of switch streams here and just take a look at some of the perception differences. I think it's fascinating to see how different we are truly made. If we take a look at sight, we're now taking a look at the eyeball. Now, I haven't put up a picture, but you can imagine our eyeball with a screen on the back of it, which is the retina, and it contains a bunch of photoreceptors, the rods, which really help us to distinguish black and white, and the cones that are for color. And we as women have a lot more cones than men. However, men's eyes are better designed for longer distance vision over a narrower field, and especially at night. Combined with a male's excellent spatial ability, men can recognize and identify oncoming traffic much more quickly than women can. But as a result, men may have a little bit more of a tunnel vision with a greater concentration, and thus they need to move their head side to side to see peripherally. The comment that was made by Walt Larimer states that this is why men get caught if they look at a beautiful woman, because they have to turn their head to actually see her, and his wife will catch it in 2 seconds. However, women have a wider peripheral vision to take in the bigger picture. Isn't that God's way? You know, who has a bunch of children? They don't all stay in the same place. You've got to keep track of these kids. They're here, there, and everywhere. We need that peripheral vision, and we also have a better color vision. So it's no wonder if your husband can't match his shirts and his ties and his socks, or they look at a rainbow and they don't see half the colors that we as women see. It's because we have more cones in our retina. With hearing, men listen with only one side of their brain, truly, and women use both. In fact, baby girls at 1 week of age can distinguish a mother's voice, whereas baby boys can't. Women can listen, comprehend, and process as many as 7 separate auditory inputs at the same time, whereas men can barely follow one. Now, this is not my comment, this is Walt Larimer's comment. However, it's very true that often if you want to speak to your husband or speak to men, you need to turn off the TV, turn down the radio, turn the music to get their concentration to focus in on what you end up having to say. Women's larger corpus callosum, which connects the right side from the left, that cable that we talked about earlier, enables her to use several connected hearing centers on both sides of her brain simultaneously. And this may be part of the reason why 6 times as many girls can sing in tune in comparison to boys. Touch and pain. Females react faster from birth and more acutely to touch and pain. In fact, the adult women's skin is at least 10 times more sensitive to touch and pressure than a man's. And contrary to popular belief, a woman's tolerance for pain actually is lower because we have so many sensory impulses from this sensitive skin. The high oxytocin levels in women not only stimulate the desire to touch, but oxytocin also sensitizes the touch sensors in our skin. Obviously, women, therefore, because of these touch sensors, have much more sensitive touch and pain sensation than men. And for your husband, it would do him wise to remember that a soft touch with his wife or a long, slow caress can actually go a long way, if you know what I mean. How about smell and taste? Males are, even as newborns, able to discern salty and sour tastes much better than women. Women, however, have more taste buds and are significantly superior at tasting bitter and complex flavors. Women are especially skilled at detecting low threshold odors, up to 5 times the magnitude greater than men. And I truly believe that this is a blessing because we can sniff out a dirty diaper way before the guys can. Women can smell her husband's pheromones and unique musk, not just consciously, but subconsciously. So what does all of this mean? Males have a stronger drive to systematize, identifying the laws that govern a certain type of system, how it works. But women, on the other hand, have a stronger drive to empathize. We recognize what another is feeling and thinking, responding with those feelings with an appropriate emotion of one's own. Because of this, systematizing and empathizing brains, we can see this manifested in multiple ways, and I'm sure many of you that have had children know this. The type of toys the kids prefer. The girls like the human-like dolls or stuffed animals. The boys like mechanical trucks. I still remember when I was taking care of my nieces and nephew that to put them to bed, I could hardly find room with all the stuffed animals in the girls' bed. But in Justin's bed, there were so many micro cars and trucks. It was unbelievable, the difference, and yet they were so young. It starts right from the beginning. The response to verbal impatience. Females try to negotiate with others. Males tend to order others. They're called to lead. Isn't this God's design from the very beginning? In navigation, women tend to personalize space by finding landmarks. And I can attest to that because when I go back to Pennsylvania, sometimes if they take down an old oak tree or something changes, I've lost my bearings. But men see a geographic system and take directions and cues in the layout of the route. This is because they have better spatial abilities. And in play, girls want to cooperate. Boys are in it for the competition. They want to compete. Spatial skills. The spatial ability of males is located in a specific and highly effective area of the right brain. Females have highly connected hemispheres, which hinder spatial processing. And they only have about 1/10 of that ability in comparison to the average male. This is not all women, but I'm just saying it does happen this way. Most women in general have difficulty in navigating with maps because they need a three-dimensional perspective to navigate the route. But men have the ability to turn a two-dimensional map into a three-dimensional view in their brain. So what Walt Larimer and Barbara Larimer talk about is that sometimes when a man is driving, it really is a test of his spatial and mathematic abilities, which allows him to drive sometimes in a way that she feels is dangerous. But remember, he has better vision distance-wise and more concentrated in one area. He can see things coming out better towards us and can navigate the spatial relationships much better than women. When we think it's dangerous, he actually feels this is totally under control. And that's part of the differences of how our brains have been wired. But isn't it wonderful that men have that ability, because in the providing, in the protecting, he has that spatial relationship that helps him when he is called to do just what God has called him to do. Stress responses. Women tend to think and feel before acting. Their brain is more inclined to process her emotional responses upward to her brain's verbal, relational, and contemplation centers. Men seem to act first and deal with their thoughts later, and feelings, if they come, are a distant third. The portions of the brain used to control aggression and anger that are needed in the men, in a sense, for protection and for provisions, these areas that control it, to suppress it somewhat, are much larger in women. Women don't enjoy these surges of testosterone that we do have at times, or vasopressin and serotonin. But men love it because it helps them in competing and fighting. And they're more likely, because of these hormones, to take risks. And we can all know that because of how our pastor keeps calling his wife the Danger Ranger.
I think so. I think that's true. Okay.
Women enjoy the surge of oxytocin from involvement in conversation and caring relationships. Some other things. The testosterone causes the amygdala to enlarge in men, and they become more aggressive. This is one of the reasons why men tend to respond more physically, aggressively, and angrily sometimes to emotional stimuli. These connections in his body make him more likely to act rather than talk. And how many women say that all they want to do sometimes is just to have their husbands listen, and they want to do something. They want to fix things. Women's amygdala connection to the frontal lobe, where impulse control and moral decisions making are handled in is much larger than men's, so she is more likely to control her emotional response, physical response to emotion. This also makes her want to talk about what she is feeling. Men actually take up to 7 hours longer than women to process emotional stimuli, thoughts, and feelings. And what the Larimers have discussed is how at times she needs to allow her husband time to process things because he is on a hunt of how to fix it. When hurt or rejected, men react physically, or they may tend to withdraw. His brain can process emotions only on one side of the brain, while she processes them on both.
Interesting.
But men can deal with logic words and use just his left side of the brain, or he can solve spatial problems using the right side of his brain and avoid activating the emotional center of the brain. And this often is needed if you're in a fight or flight condition. You don't want to be mulling around with the emotions. You want to be able to solve that problem almost immediately. Mm-hmm. Women want to talk about what's troubling them. And when she does, her brain actually produces some of these hormones we talked about that have a calming effect, like oxytocin. In women, the area of the brain that deals with emotion and emotional memories is almost always operating at the same time as other brain functions. Her brain is much more skilled at mental juggling than his. But the male brain is more compartmentalized, and this is why multitasking in women is actually much better. Women's brains are made for multitasking. And not only is a woman's brain designed to multitask, it never turns off. Intuition differences. Even before girls can understand language, they seem better than boys at reading facial expressions and better decoding nonverbal communication. And this wisdom and insight often comes to a husband from listening, actually, to his wife. So when we take a look at the brain differences, it's not that one's better than the other, but they're perfectly matched. A brain type of a guy is more systematized. Her brain is more empathizing. There's certain abilities to compartmentalize, to really concentrate on certain things that are present in the man. Multitasking is given to the woman. Be able to take care of the kids. And while she's taking care of the kids, she can hear the doorbell ringing and watch what's on the stove as something is cooking. The abilities that women need. Men tend to control their emotions better. And women have the ability less because of all the stimuli that are going up to our cortex. And as you go down the list, you can see the differences of how God has made us so different. Even communication differences. Men use the left hemisphere for verbal tasks, whereas women use both. By 3 years of age, the average girl has twice the vocabulary as the average boy. However, I know when your husband tells you, or guys tell you, that women are always talking and they talk more, there have been medical experiments done with actually voice-activated recorders on both men and women. And we actually speak about the same number of words, 16,000 words a day. The main difference, everybody can tell this, men tend to talk about technology and sports. Try to get a guy to stop talking about sports or interrupting his conversation about sports. It's nigh unto impossible. But women, we talk about relationships. We talk about emotions so much more. Men have a small hippocampus and are less likely to remember emotional experiences. So they are less likely to identify and communicate their emotions. Man's capability to feel and express emotions is more physical and separated from his ability to verbally express that. Women obviously are just the opposite. We're designed to connect memories, words, and feelings. When a man is dealing with a project, a problem, a stress, an emotion, they typically become very quiet. His right brain is trying to solve the problem, dealing with the emotion. Because of his compartmentalized brain, he can only do one thing at a time, and it's hard for him to use his left brain to speak, to listen. So when a man is sitting quiet, his brain either is at rest or he's having a conversation with himself, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. Whereas women, our brains never rest when we're dealing with a problem. We only want to talk about it. We need to talk about it. But we're not necessarily looking or trying to find a solution for the problem in the same way men do. So decoding communication differences, men tend to speak the language of action and aggression, of dominance, of decision-making. And isn't that a wonderful thing? Because God has called men to be the leaders, to be able to protect and provide for his family. Women, on the other hand, thrive on the language of relationships. Men are more direct, concrete, factual in verbal communication. And I wish I had the time to go over all the examples that Walt and Barb actually show to bring these points out, but we would be here forever. Women use indirect talk and language, not as literally. So we're going to just take a little time and talk about one of these topics that you may want to tell the children to leave at this point. Men tend to be physically oriented, but women tend to be emotionally and relationship oriented. Men are stimulated by images and sight. And this is so important in this day and age that we have young women Older women, watch how they dress. Women are stimulated, on the other hand, by feelings, by smell, by touch, by words. Men are like microwaves and are difficult to distract during sex. Women are like crock pots and easier to distract. So from the onset of foreplay to orgasm, an average man takes about 2.5 minutes, whereas a woman takes about 13 minutes. During this time of sex, the man is predominantly right-brained. He is so intent on the process that he is almost completely deaf and can't talk. Women, on the other hand, we multitask. We can have sex and talk at the same time. So it's not a time to ask your husband to be talking to you while you're doing this thing. Men need an orgasm for sexual satisfaction, but women do not. And their orgasm is short, intense, physically oriented, and solitary, whereas women's orgasms are slow, more intense, emotionally oriented, and potentially multiple. Women really enjoy the intimacy, but men enjoy the sex. And for those of you that are married, remember, this sexual act for a man actually helps him. He needs this because it helps to calm him. It helps to actually deal with the stress that he feels because it elevates some of the hormones that we as women have a lot more of. His brain, her brain. So as we can see, there's big differences. The provision, the conquest of male brain requires respect that God calls us to have for our husbands. Whereas on her brain, there is more nurturing, security, and love that is emphasized. So when we look at the Bible, Adam's was Yatzar, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing these right, but he was molded or formed from clay. But a woman was banad, meaning complexly designed and built. The word that they used when they were building Solomon's temple. Men are more rural, practical, to be the wife's protector. Women are designed and built to be beautiful, stable, durable, like a jewel in a crown. Woman is Ezer, meaning one who saves from extremity, one who delivers from death, help or relief in danger, or one who affords relief. And so this actually describes women as a rescuer of men, one who releases him from the bondage of aloneness, from his own insufficiency or ineffectiveness in living and ministering alone. So women are to supply what is lacking in a man. But in a likewise, the men logically supply what are lacking in us. It's a dual thing. The helper, Neged Ezer, literally means according to the opposite of him. It's why women and men are made oppositely. Thus the woman is perfectly matched to the man. And becoming one flesh is a process of physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual development that deepens in intensity along with those hormones that God has given us and strengthens with the passage of time. So there's beauty in God's design. It takes sacrificial love, the one another's that Pastor talked about before, as well as sacrificial respect. When husband and wives understand the difference between their brain biology and biochemistry, they are more able to see clearly and understand how they can become one, how the other part of this process is processing things within their heads. God's blueprint for marriage actually sets one free to be exactly who God created one to be. Remember, we talked about we're all equal in God's sight, but that doesn't mean we're the same. We have different roles. The secret to success when it comes to marital happiness and satisfaction is to accept the plan and assistance of our Creator who designed us and made us. Each person makes an active and unique contribution to that marriage, and each depends on the other. And this actually is brought out a lot in chapter 22 when it starts talking from the book that we're going through, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It talks about that high calling of wives and motherhood in the biblical perspective. Because of how God has wired men and women, men are biologically created to act, direct, lead, provide for, and protect in the home and in church, supported by the woman's affirmation and respect. Women are biologically created to affirm, receive, and nurture in the home and in the church, submitting to that man's leadership and support, and being supported by his protection, security, and love. Although we have not talked about the biologic differences in the body, I think everyone can see the differences between a man's body and the woman's body. And so that's why I focused on the neurologic aspects, the genetic and the hormonal aspect, because it's more unseen. But even the structures of our bodies, these two support the roles that God has designed for men and women as well. So I've given you a summary of a little bit of what was in his brain, her brain, by the Larimers. And although there's much discussion that has to do with the differences of men and women with respect to strengthening one's marriage, I think it's important to understand these differences as we as singles navigate in this world as well. The more we understand the differences between how the men's brain and the women's brain actually work in the workplace, we can help to reinforce and support each other in the various roles that God has called us to. I think this is one of those ways where we just really can see that this is in God's plan. It's God's design. He built this into us even from the womb. It's not all about nurture over nature. Much of it already has started in our biologic chemistries and beings, even before we were born. So that's the end of my talk. I hope I didn't flood you with a lot of facts, but I really find that it's fascinating as I look at these differences, and it would be great if we could take a look at them while we're seeing the brain scans of how a man reacts versus a woman. And much of this is in the medical literature that helps us to understand that we were made to complement each other. There is no role that is greater than the other. But together, we can be what God wants us to be in perfect union and be much better than anyone could be working separately. So I will quit talking, and I'm going to give the floor to Elisa.
Well, I'm right here. I really appreciate what you presented to us today, because it's helped me as I've thought through some of the issues I have in our own home, and helping me to be more understanding of my husband and his role, his reaction sometimes where I've had, when he's gotten quiet and telling me he's just thinking, I see now how he's completely wired that way. But tell you what, if you'd open up your chat, are there any questions that you might have for Barb at this time? If you could send them through chat, then she would be more than glad to answer them as much as she could. Are there any there? Let's just wait a second to see if any of them come in. I might want to say, if you look at, while we're waiting for that, in our book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, at the end, at the conclusion of chapter 16, I thought it was a very interesting paragraph. Let me pull that up. When we talk about all these differences and how we're wired differently, no wonder communication in marriage can be challenging. But just before the conclusion of that chapter, I think it'd be good to consider under the section about stress, how women and men manage their stress. In today's world, we find so many, the statistics for divorce and separation are over the moon, in seeing our families destroyed in America. But I wanted you to pick up on the page 292 at the bottom. It talks about when women are stressed and vulnerable to extramarital affairs. When one of these 5 needs is not met in their marriages. 1 is the need for affection, 2, the need for conversation, 3, the need for honesty, the need for minimal financial well-being, and also the need for family commitment. And we can see that her relational needs are primary, and as we listen to Barb today, that's for sure. But we need to be understand these things about ourselves. But I thought it was interesting as I listened to her what the 5 reasons that a man would violate his marriage and seek fulfillment. And again, this book is based on not just an idea, but some studies. But number 1 is the lack of sexual fulfillment. Number 2, the lack of recreational companionship. 3, the lack of an attractive spouse, the lack of domestic support, and the lack of admiration, love, and respect we talk about in marriage. The woman's more relational, and then as Barb explained today, how important it is, the man is much different, but that sexual fulfillment in marriage, how important that is. So just some thoughts. Please read through those last paragraphs of chapter 16. Tell you what, are there any questions out there that you'd like to bring in? There was a lot to think about today. But tell you what, I think we're going to go offline here in a minute or two. And if you would like to add questions later, send them to me, send them to Karen. We can get them to Barb or deal directly with Barb after this presentation today. This has been a unique study, a presentation. We try to focus, just for those who may be listening in today, we try to focus on biblical principles, scripture, as we talk about physical things today. We didn't bring in a lot of scripture, Psalm 139. Typically, we do try to look at that. So next week, we'll be trying to look at our topic. And also in the questions, you'll receive some Bible verses to study and look at in preparation for next week.